Now let us take the fourth and the final wave or the final phase of India's looking towards east, and that is the shift from look east policy to the act east policy. That happened in 2014 when a new government took office in India under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the name was changed. The question arises, the first question which arises is, why was the name changed? I think name was changed for 2-3 very specific reasons. We do not know how the leadership was thinking at that time, but certainly the ownership of the policy, I think new leadership was very strong, huge majority. They wanted to give a print of its own quality and its own leadership on the policy. The Look East was a policy which was coming up, which was continuing since 1990s, almost 3 decades. So they wanted to change it. So the first reason was to have the ownership of the policy, and there was a new Prime Minister who was very assertive, who wanted to identify his own acts and his own policies with himself and with his regime. Therefore, this was, I think, one of the important reasons. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, that there were expectations out of India from the US, West particularly in general, and US specifically, and ASEAN, that India was not matching up to their expectations so far as India's role in the region was concerned. Therefore, it was felt necessary to give an impression to the US and to the West and to the ASEAN countries that India was willing to and prepared to do something very, very strongly so far as the eastern region or extended neighbors were concerned. So to meet these expectations, I think it was considered appropriate to change the name. Third reason was that, look, there were changes taking place in the region, particularly in terms of the great power equations. The US was increasingly appearing to be less inclined to get involved into the regional responsibilities. It was not abandoning the region, but there was a sort of a fatigue which came out of Iraq, came out of Afghanistan, and there were statements that US wanted to retreat from extended responsibilities. And to meet that demand, they redesigned a policy called US Pivot, where the statement was made that US was shifting its emphasis from West Asia and other theaters and bringing it back to Southeast Asia or to the ASEAN region, if we want to call it. This policy was later on renamed as US Rebalance Policy from Pivot. And in that rebalance policy, US thought that India occupies a very critical place. India occupied a very critical place because of its placement in the Indian Ocean. And in the east, the ocean played a very, very important role, especially because China was rising, expanding into the ocean areas, and also expanding on various other neighbors, impinging upon them in a very adverse manner. So it was suspected that China wants to take over the role of regional management from the US, and the US hegemony was under some sort of a pressure. To meet that challenge, US redesigned its policy, and that was of the rebalance. And within that, you found that US calculations were now quite strongly based on India's significance and India's position, and wanted India to share some of the burden. You would recall that the US at that time had even redefined its alliance relationship with Japan, to some extent also with Australia, and even with Korea, and wanted new countries to participate with the US initiatives as US strategic partners in which even Vietnam and Indonesia were roped in. But India had a special role, and in order to meet that, they wanted India to play a much bigger role because China was rising, China was asserting. And this became very clear in the statements made by Obama and Hillary Clinton that India has to occupy and play a major role so far as the affairs of Southeast Asian countries were concerned. When Obama visited India in 2010, he addressed Indian Parliament, and in Parliament he said, we want India not only to look east, but want India to engage with east and become a much more, a long statement. In fact, India on India's role in Myanmar, Obama literally rebuked that India was not playing enough of a role. So there was a very clear emphasis for India to come in. And Hillary Clinton also, even earlier, later on also, earlier in the Pacific address also, I started emphasizing that India should look east. There is an interesting side to this. Sushma Swaraj, who was then in opposition leader in 2010, 2011, said that she was the one who whispered to Hillary Clinton that India must play a more active role in the East now. And Hillary Clinton made it public in her name. She said this to us in our ISAS lecture, in which she said, I had the occasion to engage with Clinton, that is Mrs. Clinton, during her visit to my country in June. I said the time had come not only to look east but act east. It was most heartening to find that she incorporated many of the points we discussed in the course of her public lecture. So the idea was that the emphasis was that this was an idea which was of Sushma Swaraj, which she let it be expressed through Hillary Clinton. And Obama had earlier, even in 2010, had asked India to play a larger role. So there was need to revamp, repackage Look East policy, and that's why its name was changed. Now, if we look at it closely, the question would arise, how different was Act East from the Look East? My submission is that the difference was not in the basic structure of the policy. So far as the basic tenets of the policy are concerned, the thrust of the policy in economic, in strategic, even in socio-cultural matter was the same. But there was a lot of difference in the dynamism with which the policy was executed. So it was in the execution of the policy that Act East was radically different from Look East. But if you look at the substance of the policy in terms of the objectives and goals, etc., I think it was the same thrust which continued, and therefore Act East represents both continuation of the policy as also the change. And this you can notice in various official statements where very senior officers, even ministers, even in parliamentary question answer, Look East and Act East is being used simultaneously. Sometimes we are carrying Look East, we are carrying Act East policy. Now, how in execution it was different. Firstly, there is a serious effort now on the part of Prime Minister Modi and his government to bridge the communication gap with all these countries in the neighborhood, both in the immediate neighborhood as also in the extended eastern neighborhood, where the communication gap has been bridged by Prime Minister undertaking visits. For 15 years, 20 years, Indian Prime Ministers and Indian senior officials had not visited these countries. He almost covered almost every country and tried to establish rapport personally at the highest leadership and try to forge an understanding at the personal level with all the warmth. So this bridging of communication gap has been a very important aspect of the Act East policy. Then also we find that there are new mechanisms of engagement which have been evolved, like 2+2 meetings. 2+2 means the 2 defense ministers and the 2 foreign ministers, and their collective meetings in order to take stock of the critical and strategic issues which are there. There are many minilaterals or plurilaterals as it is being called. What it means is that the groups of 2, 3, 4 and multiple countries India is interacting with, and wherever, and the underlying assertion is that these are all issue-based alliances, that the interest, wherever there is a convergence of interest, India is willing to participate with all other countries. So you have minilaterals and multilaterals like Russia, India and China together in one meeting, India, Japan and US in another meeting. India is also trying to have meetings with Japan and Korea. They are trying to have an effort. And this kind of multilateral or minilaterals are being conceived and being pursued. Then at the nature of strategic partnership of India with the major players of the country have been forged with almost everybody. But the nature of these strategic partnerships are different. For instance, India's strategic partnership with US is qualitatively different from, say, with Japan, or say with Australia, or even with China. So you find different levels of strategic partnerships which have been forged. And lastly, in terms of difference with the Look East, there is a whole lot of emphasis on the soft power, on the use of cultural and civilizational contexts, on the use of diaspora, on the use of yoga. For instance, India has taken initiative to call for Buddhist conferences, even a conference of the Buddhist foreign ministers. All the Buddhist countries and their foreign ministers are being. Then yoga has been propagated at international level. Yoga Day is being celebrated all around. Wherever Prime Minister goes, there are huge diaspora meetings where persons of Indian origin are brought and a direct communication is established with them to revive India's image and India's assistance. In addition to that, there is also a great deal of emphasis on the humanitarian assistance, and which has now taken the place of what you call the vaccine diplomacy, looking at the corona. So whether it is a question of tsunami, or whether it is a question of earthquakes, or somebody needing water, all kind of humanitarian assistance. And I think the pandemic has opened up several opportunities for India, where through vaccine diplomacy we can forge much closer relations with the countries of the region. Now, this is how the differences are. Differences with the Look East have been underlined, and India is pursuing this policy. Now, while pursuing this policy, a new development has taken place, and that new development is the redefining of the region as a whole. And that redefinition has, what was being called as an Afro-Asian region is now called the Indo-Pacific region. And this Indo-Pacific region stretches from India up to the Western Pacific, including the western coast of the US, which is a huge region, and this is a region where China is asserting itself. I think it is largely due to the Chinese challenge posed to the US and to the region that this new nomination has come up. India has endorsed this new concept. But after hesitation, initially India had a lot of hesitation in endorsing the Indo-Pacific, because the idea was first articulated publicly by the Japanese Prime Minister Abe. And it was thought that, and US had supported it, Australia supported it, So it was considered that it will appear that India is joining the Western Bloc. I think that was a wrong assumption because for the first time even the Indian Navy had used the Indo-Pacific expression way back in 2004. And even in 2007, before Abe's announcement, some of the Indian scholars at the Defense Institute had referred to Indo-Pacific as a concept. Anyway, we late but der ayat durast ayat. I think we have rightly accepted this notion. Why rightly? Because we have very deep, as I have been mentioning to you earlier, very deep cultural links with this region, and we should, strategically it is important, economically it is important for us. Having accepted, I think the best articulation at the highest level came from Prime Minister Modi in his Shangri-La address, which he delivered in Singapore, in which in 2018, in which he made 5 points, six points very categorically. And let me spell out those points. To first, that India thinks that Indo-Pacific is a region which should be open and inclusive. Secondly, he said ASEAN is central in this region and the Indian policy will follow ASEAN. Then it has to evolve a rule-based order. It should be free and with equal access to all the countries under the international law. There should be no protectionist solutions, but those that embrace the change. We must bring about change, but without protectionism. The connectivity initiatives based on trust and respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity. This was in indirect reference to China's BRI, because China's BRI is not open and it has violated sovereignty of some of the countries, say even for India, by they working in the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and that is one of the very important reasons why India has not accepted it. The same concept has been further elaborated upon Dr. Jaishankar, a foreign minister, even earlier, and he made 6 or 7 points again about the Indo-Pacific, and let me briefly underline them. Indo-Pacific must be perceived as the further exploration of Act East or Look East policy, maturing in terms of its eastward shift. Indo-Pacific is as much as our past as our future. As I mentioned, that we have deep historical and cultural roots there. India would be no longer limited in the pursuit of its interest to its immediate neighbors, which means that Indo-Pacific provides a chance for India to come out of the South Asian box and play a much larger role in Asia. Core interests are in the Indian Ocean. Then he said contribution to a stable balance of power in Asia can be sought through Indo-Pacific. The development of Andaman and Nicobar Islands would surely rank foremost so far as this is concerned. And eventually, now the Ministry of External Affairs has come out with a well-articulated narrative on what is India's outlook so far as Indo-Pacific is concerned. Now, if we look at this region, which was earlier known as ASEAN region or Afro-Asian region, is now much bigger one. And the main areas which have developed there, I think we must flag them. 2-3 major developments have taken place and we must take note of it. I would say 3 major developments have taken place. One is the deepening of China-US rivalry and competition. And for that, there are 2 very obvious reasons. One is that China has become far more assertive and aggressive. We in India feel that assertion and aggressions in Galwan face-off, in Dokolam face-off, and the question of boundary which continues to linger. But it is not only India. The Chinese have been asserting themselves vis-a-vis Japan also vis-a-vis Vietnam, vis-a-vis Indonesia, vis-a-vis Philippines, in South China Sea. So there is a clear Chinese assertive and aggressive stance in the region, and that has helped to deepen or sharpen rivalry with the US. And the US again is economically getting weakened or confused whether it can carry on with all the responsibilities, and therefore trying to fear, sort of fearing that China would encroach upon its hegemony in the region, which it should fight back. The resolve to fight back has been far more assertively articulated under the Trump administration. Whether you see the documents on US strategic approach, or you see the statements of some of its leaders, in the PowerPoint you find I have given Pompeo's statement, which very clearly says that the challenge from China would be met by all the capacity, all the might which the US has at its command. So this aspect of the US asserting, and the whole question of trade with China, which has been brought up front, and the US is saying that we will not concede on trade and economic matters to China. Trump, even during Trump region, even some of the American companies were asked to fold up from the Chinese theater and probably go and invest somewhere else. And even on technological fronts, there are a lot of issues which have come up. So that's a separate subject, but the imposing feature of the Indo-Pacific today is this rivalry between US and China. Second important feature is the pandemic, which has completely shaken the world. But as I said, this has provided opportunity for India to play its health diplomacy. India is considered as the world's pharmacy, and so far as vaccines are concerned, it can produce much more, and we can use it, which we are doing it. In fact, with the liberal exports of the vaccine and liberal distribution of the vaccine, India can do a lot. The third important aspect, which is related to the pandemic and also related to the US-China rivalry in the economic field, is the economic contraction which has taken place in this part of the world. The rates of growth have gone down and the economies have suffered. Many of the supply chains have been totally disrupted, and as I mentioned earlier, that industries are shifting from one place to another. So these features are very important, which are defining the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, and much would depend upon how these features really come up. There are core policy dimensions and factors shaping regional dynamics which are there. In terms of Act East policy, I very briefly underline what are we looking for. We are looking for consolidating India's centrality in the Indian Ocean. And this centrality can be consolidated by having security tie-up with the island neighbors, with other countries, Bay of Bengal countries in the region, even by fortifying Andaman and Nicobar Island, which gives us an outreach even to South China Sea, and engagement with the major powers. Secondly, we are also looking for a multifaceted integration with the region. Multifaceted in terms of institutional, organizational integration. We have mentioned about it, that we are members of all the regional organizations, ASEAN, IORA, EAS, all of them. Secondly, economically, trade and investment have got to be emphasized. We are even seeking a membership of the APEC, TTP, we became a member. RCEP, I'll come to it in a short while. And thirdly, strategically, by emphasizing military diplomacy, we are providing security. We have emerged as a security provider to many of the smaller countries of the region, At the same time, the level of security cooperation with the major players of the country has been increased in terms of military exercises, in terms of exchange of defense technologies, and now India has even shed off its hesitation of exporting arms. And not only this, to some countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh, we have even extended the line of credit to buy arms from. This is a new, and again there is an emphasis on the maritime security. We also are looking for a very deepening engagement with other major players like US, Japan, Australia, ASEAN. And the whole challenge lies in managing the what you call this Sino-US rivalry. We are playing this in a very balancing manner. While our strategic proximity with the US has tremendously increased by signing those foundational agreements and upping the levels of technology exchanges, upping the levels of military exercises, the interoperability of the weapon systems, sharing of intelligence, various other areas in which we have increased. But at the same time, we are trying to keep our communications open and engagement open with China. And that is being done through other fora like Russia-China India Forum. We are also member of SCO. Bilaterally also we are trying to engage with China, though there are a lot of strains because of the border problem even in the economic field. But this management of balanced relationship in terms of the competition and rivalry between US-China is a very critical challenge to India's policy. These are some of the important aspects of how our policies should proceed further. Now, what are the policy outcomes? The Act East policy, what has it yielded? What has it achieved? To begin with, India has been acknowledged as a major stakeholder in this region. All the countries of the region have tremendous respect for India. They want India to play a role, much different from what the situation was during the 80s, late 80s particularly. Our trade prospects are, trade and investment prospects are tugged on to this region. We want to increase the trade. I'll come to the question. We have substantial trade. In fact, why South China Sea becomes important for us because almost 40 to 48% of our trade is now coming through the east, and therefore we have to look and guard for the security of our trade. We have, as I said, greater strategic proximity with the US and US allies, where we also have a formation called Quad, which is a part of the minilaterals and multilaterals, and also with France, Indonesia, and Vietnam, which are not the allies of the US, but as Asian countries and major players, we are having very close relations with them. Collaboration with US and Japan in third countries is a new feature of India's foreign policy, and that is also growing very consciously. Earlier, India was very hesitant in its neighborhood to work with any other third power, but now that hesitation has been put off. And lastly, the northeast region of India, which was supposed to be the major factor in our Act East policy, has been opened up, and it is being linked. But having said, there are also gaps in the policy. One, we are falling short on the trade and economic affairs. We have not participated in RCEP, which is a major issue. It's almost a crisis. All the countries expect, we need a lot of economic reforms and in order to attract investments, labor reforms, infrastructure reforms, ease of doing business. Without that, the shifting industries would not come to India, Indonesia, and countries like Sri Lanka. And if we have to attract them, we have to rejuggle or restructure our economic incentives. There is the delivery deficit on our part in terms of connectivity. Some of the projects in Myanmar which link up with the ASEAN region are still not complete. The great highway linking up to Vietnam, the railroad projects, even the Kaladan project is still struggling in one way or the other. There are also variations in Indo-Pacific outlooks of different countries. We have one attitude, US has certain variations from our attitude, Japan has certain variations, ASEAN has certain variations. And lastly, I would say that there are gaps and problems in the use of soft power by India. I think we are emphasizing a lot on Hinduism and Buddhism, but we must take care also to project Islam as a part of India's composite culture. Because there are many countries which are Islamic countries, and some of our internal developments like the Constitutional Amendment Act in terms of citizenship or unnecessarily political statements on minorities are giving trouble to many of our Islamic neighbors, and we must be careful about it. The Rohingya issue, for instance, created a lot of problem for India between Myanmar and Bangladesh, and we should take care to see it. On the whole, I think we have good prospects of playing our role in the Indo-Pacific region. This is an engagement which will grow very clearly, though organizations like Quad, etc., will be very cautiously calibrated. There is also considerable scope for India having defense and the health and education area doing a lot in this region. But for all that, India has to have economic growth, and we have to fine-tune some of the aspects of our soft power so that people don't take an offense to what we have been doing. I hope this is a policy parameter which will be of great help to India in the coming years. Thank you.